Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night to you, wherever you are, whenever you are making the wonderful decision to tune into the Out of Spec podcast with me, your host, Francie. Thank you for being here. We talk about everything EV, and I am based in the US, but I love to take a global perspective as always. So we are driving into a fascinating topic today: why Norway leads the world in electric vehicle adoption. Did you know that battery electric vehicles have held a pretty impressive market share of over 85% in Norway for the past 3 years? To put that into perspective, in 2023, the US had 7% market share of BEVs, a figure that is similar to where Norway was back in 2013. So, what has propelled Norway so far ahead in the EV game and EV adoption, and why does it seem to work so well for folks over in Norway? We have our very own Roaming Norway, aka William, aka my buddy on the podcast, an EV enthusiast, friend to any other EV enthusiast, coming onto the podcast in a minute to tell us all about Norway's evolution as a very electric country. Let's plug in. This episode is made possible by the support we get from Fort Collins Kia. If you are in the market for any electric Kia, not only do they never add market adjustments, they will deliver your car to you anywhere in the 48 contiguous states for out-of-spec viewers. More information in the link in the show notes. So as we'll get into the conversation with William, there are several key factors at play here, from incentives from the government that come from, as you might know, Norway's huge oil exporting industry. There are a lot of benefits that you got in the beginning and you still get as someone who purchases an EV. Another critical aspect of it is that they have pretty competitive pricing for electric vehicles. And something that I think is really interesting that we'll talk about with William is the actual landscape of Norway and how that serves to benefit the efficiency of EVs. Stay tuned for that. They also have invested heavily in charging infrastructure. We will talk about that as well, because that's very important. And the climate. Norway is northern. It can get pretty cold sometimes. How has reliability been proven in this cold climate, this often cold climate? Also, there are EV enthusiasts like Bjorn, who is, a huge content creator when it comes to electric and has been pretty influential in the space as well. And we will consider the environment, all the factors that play into Norway being so very successful in going electric, all the factors combined, and what William has to say about it. So enough of me chatting. Let's bring him onto the podcast to see what he has to share. Hope you enjoy. We are now back in the podcast studio. I am joined by William, aka Roaming Norway, aka my friend in the podcast. You help me do research, etc. And today you're going to tell me about Norway, and you are calling in from Norway. Thank you for joining me on your very early morning and my late evening to come on the Out of Spec podcast for, your first official episode on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to finally be in front of the camera, and I'll see what I can talk about today.
Yeah, I'm pretty curious about it. I think obviously you are living in Norway, you're Norwegian, you know about EVs. Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what is Roaming Norway? How did you get into electric vehicles? What's your story, William?
In 2021, I bought a Tesla Model 3 because it was, of course, one of the most popular cars in Norway. It's affordable in Norway compared to other vehicles. And I wanted to try to drive electric after watching for example, Out of Spec and Bjørn Nyland, which is a popular YouTuber in Norway. And I thought I might have some insights or thoughts when I drive around Norway, because I do drive quite a lot, and it's nice to do it in an electric vehicle, especially in a country like Norway. And I'll talk a lot about that, of course, in this podcast.
You will. Yeah. Okay, great. So you're a Tesla driver, and we'll talk a bit about, maybe the common brands that you see. But I think Norway is an interesting, not only are you from Norway, so that's convenient, but Norway has achieved a really impressive, per capita EV adoption rate. You have the highest EV adoption rate in the world. You're a class leader. And although you're, technically like a smaller country than some huge countries, it seems that there was a really big push, a ton of incentives, regulation in the beginning of of Norway's EV transition, and now you're seeing kind of all the benefits from that. Of course, if you like an electric society. So I kind of want to start with, yeah, this 85 or more percent market share for battery electric vehicles in Norway in recent years. How, like, when did this all start? Norway obviously didn't start, yesterday adopting EVs to get these kind of numbers. So when did it start and how did it first unfold with, I don't know, just EV adoption in general?
Yeah, there are many stories on EV adoption in Norway, and a lot of stories has come out these later years of different EV projects in the early 2000s. We even made some electric vehicles. The Think City, which is a very small electric car with lead acid batteries, not very, but it was kind of like a start. Anyways, we got the sales tax in Norway, which is 25% added or 20% effective tax rate, removed in 2001 on electric vehicles. And it wasn't before like 2011 when we got the Nissan Leaf and vehicles like that we actually saw a significant market share. And from 2011 until now, it has just been a crazy curve. So in 2011 with the Nissan Leaf, and then 2013, I think, with the Tesla Model S, which was like the first real long-range EV, maybe apart from the Renault Zoe, but it came out at almost the same time, I think. And the Model S looks more like a normal car, and that was a big thing in Norway. And it just snowballed from 2013 until today, really. And in 2013, we were at 6-7% market share, which is where the United States is today.
Yeah, so we can see the example that Norway has painted in your own version of it, right? Like, I think I've looked at Norway for other kind of studies into just kind of the government approach in a lot of ways. I've looked at education and stuff, and there are distinct ways that Norway has approached certain aspects of human life, and this one is transportation. And I would love to talk about the government decisions there that made it so that there are so many people deciding to buy an EV. So they must have made it kind of a nice option, especially when embracing a new technology, when back then, when there wasn't a ton of proof that this would be a good option for people. So what about the incentives do you think are kind of the ones that stand out to you as really influential?
First of all, it's of course the removal of the sales tax, which is actually being reintroduced slowly now, but I'll talk about that in the future portion. It's cheaper registration. You have like a fee for registering vehicles, and it's cheaper. We had the option to use the bus lane for quite a while, which is a super nice perk for people living in cities, because you can just skip the queue. And there was and is still a minimum discount in toll roads. For a while, everything was free, which is there are quite a few toll roads in Norway, so having free toll roads is a significant saving for many people. Discounted parking in cities, and these incentives change as we speak. For example, the free bus lane was removed just in May for Oslo and some other counties, but these were super important incentives, and I think that's the number one for EV adoption in Norway, are actually these incentives. And having the removal of the sales tax, that's a 25% slapped on the price of everything in Norway. Almost, it's VAT, value added tax, but it's basically the same as a sales tax in Norway, in the United States. Sorry, And having that removed made the vehicles actually quite cheap to operate and to buy.
That's what it seems, is that it's definitely aside from kind of the bus lane access, which is convenience, that it's very financially motivated, taking off the sales tax, making registration cheaper, no fees, discounted parking. It's all cost oriented. And I think that is probably a really effective way to show people what could be a good next step for them if they want to adopt EVs. It also makes me a little bit curious. Yeah, these are good incentives, but do you have more information about why Norway, the government, the country, your country, decided that they would throw so many incentives at electric? Why, like, where did that come from?
Well, Norway is always trying to get a better reputation, first of all, because Norway is actually one of the largest oil producers and exporters in the world, despite being quite a small country. And of course, we can afford this as a country. We can afford these incentives. We seem to do not get high on your own supply kind of thinking, because we don't use much oil for transportation anymore. We peaked in 2016, I think, and of course we have other issues with the climate stuff and stuff like that. But it's always trying to be good where you are able to be good, at least, because the oil industry is important for jobs and stuff like that in Norway. So it's always just trying to do the best you can, I think, and also the reputation of the country, of course.
Yeah, okay, that is interesting. I like you saying don't get high on your own supply. Yeah, we produce incredible amounts of oil for the oil industry, but we're going to drive mostly electric over here. That's an interesting, I think, motivation. And it does make sense. Like, yeah, it's quite a wealthy country. Let's throw the incentives at going electric. And I think while the financial incentives are so important, people actually have to start to enjoy it, right? Where they make this choice on their own. And like what's kind of happening, some incentives are being pulled back. I think we'll see that over time generally in this industry, that there's a lot of incentives up front, maybe not enough in some places, maybe a ton in other places. We're still seeing exactly how it plays out. Seemed that it played out pretty well here in our little small model of this kind of experiment. And I also, I think about, okay, so I can get a really cheap EV. It can be cheap to own it, but how is living with an EV in Norway? Is it easy to get around? What's the charging infrastructure like? What are the most popular EVs on the road? Couple questions.
Yeah. So we got our first fast chargers in 2011, or 50 kilowatts fast chargers. And living with an EV in Norway is super easy for many reasons. And it's, of course, the charging infrastructure and the price of the EVs. For example, a Tesla Model 3 rear-wheel drive, the Highline one, costs 33,600 United States dollars just to buy, and that's delivered, everything finito, no additional fees. For comparison, a Toyota Corolla costs 41,600 United States dollars delivered, and it's of course cheap to buy, and that makes the barrier of entry low. But it's also something else, and that's the low speed limits of Norway, which I want to talk about, because you can drive much farther before stopping because of the low speed limits. And it's not because there are just arbitrary low speed limits, but there are like curvy roads, and you have to drive a certain speed there. And we have 623 kilometers or 387 miles of highway total in Norway, like two-lane or four-lane highways in Norway. The rest is like kind of like B roads with 80, 90 kilometers per hour or 50 miles per hour speed limits around there.
Oh.
and that makes the consumption of the vehicles low. And compared to United States, you have highways which are very exposed to wind, for example, and they are just straight through. And that's how you get between cities in the United States. So you will use a lot more power, really. I do have an example here, if it's okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. For example, I looked at the video Ryan did for out of spec reviews for the LFP rear-wheel drive Model 3 in the US, driving at 70 miles per hour in the range test. I took the LFP rear-wheel drive Model 3 because it's one of the most efficient electric vehicles ever made, I think, apart from the Lucid Air or something. And it got 132 watt-hour per kilometer on that stretch, which is 223 watt-hour per mile, or 4.48 miles per kilowatt-hour. That's awesome, right? That's 70 miles per hour, which is not even the maximum speed that
Wow.
electric vehicles go in the United States. But my dual motor, which is less efficient, Model 3, from Oslo to Bergen, last time I tested it, got 118 watt-hour per kilometer, 189 watt-hour per mile, or 5.25 miles per kilowatt-hour. So much more efficient, which means that in the United States, you use a lot more power to get between, more energy to get between cities than, for example, in Norway. So I could drive like 6-7 hours without charging. In the United States, you would drive like 3 hours between charging. It depends on how long you stay at the charger, of course. But there is like the transportation thing. It's easier to just get around because of this.
Wow, that is quite different to be able to go for that long without charging up on a road trip. And I think that is oftentimes a sticking point with folks in the US, is that how many times are you stopping to charge? And even when I break it down over my like long road trip, it was just 16% of my time spent charging, and some of my charging stops were long. But to be able to stretch it out like that is super valuable, and I think really changes the game. And you were talking about efficiency, and it makes me think of also temperature, because that has been a discussion. There were huge headlines about EVs can't live in the cold. And it's like, okay, America, there are other countries out there with EVs that get cold. So maybe, can you tell me a little bit about that, living in a sometimes very cold climate and driving electric? What are the challenges? What really happens?
Yes. So cold climate is definitely something to think about with EVs, and that's the main criticism of people in Norway who doesn't like EVs either. But this winter, for example, it has shown that it's not as bad as you would think. I want to bring forward an example from Viking, which is like a rescue service. I'm not sure what it's called in the United States, but it's like the rescue service for cars if you're stuck by the road. And 87% of the cars rescued this winter was fossil cars, and 23% of the cars in Norway are electric vehicles. Of course, electric vehicles are newer, but this shows that they are not the cause of any specific concern when it comes to safety by the road and stopping by the road. And there are much more issues with starting like diesel cars in the winter. It can be, especially if you have something called AdBlue, which is an additive which can actually freeze, but also diesel cars in general can be hard to start in the winter because diesel is harder to ignite than gasoline, and most personal vehicles in Norway are actually diesel cars, not gasoline cars like the US. So there has been a lot of problems with the diesel cars, especially old diesel cars in the winter. And I think EVs has kind of helped with that, because an EV will, unless the 12-volt battery is depleted, it'll just start up in the winter, no problem. You might get a little bit of power limit, slow charging and stuff like that, but it'll start and get you to the destination, most likely, no problem at all. And Oslo and Bergen, which is the two largest cities in Norway, have a relatively mild climate. But when you get inland, you can get like minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is the same in Fahrenheit, minus 40 Fahrenheit. That's more of a concern, of course. But I think, I talked about Bjørn Nyland, which is a Norwegian YouTuber, EV YouTuber, has done a lot of testing here. He has driven a lot of electric vehicles through these areas in minus 30, minus 40 degrees Celsius. And generally speaking, there are so few issues with this. It's just higher consumption to heat the cabin. But if you have a preconditioned cabin from the beginning, it's not that big of a deal, because we don't again have those high speed limits, and high speed limits with cold weather give more resistance in the air, of course, but you don't see that part of the problem that much in Norway.
That's interesting. Okay, so I totally see that. Obviously, you can drive an EV in the cold. We've proven that. And to see that, those examples is interesting. Of course, when it gets to negative 40 degrees anything, I'm sure a lot of things have trouble surviving. So I'll continue to avoid those areas. I was thinking about the cost of electricity. So, a lot of people, it's great if you charge at home. It's kind of the preferred method of EV charging. You don't want to just DC charge your car all the time. In terms of battery health, what is the cost of electricity like? Because then I also think, okay, so you make a lot of oil. It's a huge, part of the funding in your country. But does, what's kind of your energy portfolio? What makes your energy in Norway? And then is it super expensive? What's that dynamic like?
Energy in Norway has traditionally been very cheap. Now lately it has been a little bit more expensive, because we got connected to the European market for energy. But energy produced in, for electricity produced in Norway is just renewables. So it's just hydropower for the most part, a little bit of wind, but mostly hydropower, like 99% plus hydropower in Norway. And it has traditionally been very affordable. A little bit more expensive now lately, and a little bit more peaking. But generally speaking, energy has been quite cheap in Norway, and also helped with EV adoption.
And what are charging sites usually like? Here we see sometimes they're in a parking lot of a supermarket, or they are maybe at like a fueling station. Where can you typically find EV chargers in Norway?
Everywhere. Almost every, we don't call them gas stations anymore. It's called energy stations, because most of them, or many of them, actually have just EV charging on them. And some have replaced the gas pumps with EV chargers, so you have them under the roof the exact same way that a gas pump works. Aside from that, we have, of course, Tesla superchargers, which are usually just right by the highway in convenient locations, with pull-through stalls for the most part, because especially in rural areas, because we do a lot of towing in Norway, just with small trailers, but we do a lot of towing, so it's nice to have pull-through stalls. And that's where the EV chargers mostly are located. And of course, people in Norway often have home charging. Very many people have the ability to have home charging because of course, incentives in the cities, but also there are a lot of duplexes or just houses in Norway. So it's easy to just install.
Yeah, pretty easy to have it. You talked about incentives for home charging. What do those look like? Is it paying for the charger? Yeah.
In Norway, we have less cash incentives. There are very few of them. What I meant by incentives, I meant that cities install charging at the street, so you can charge at home. Typically, you would pay in full for your own home charging equipment at your house, for example. But in the cities, you have these charging posts all alongside the street parking. So if you live in an apartment, it's possible to own an EV without the hurdle of daily fast charging at the DC fast charger.
Yeah, we call those like curbside charging, where it's
Yes.
right there on the curb. So it makes me curious to see. I mean, you've been studying a lot of the U.S. market, obviously, before and during helping me out with the podcast. But what is your perspective of like the U.S. compared to Norway, and what you've experienced with EVs, ranging from EV charging to incentives to everything? What kind of has stood out?
I think the US have some kind of it's kind of extreme on some levels when it comes to incentives, because suddenly you have states like Colorado where you can stack like 2-3 incentives on top of each other and then get a free EV. It's not or very affordable EV, and in Norway it's not like that. There are almost no cash incentives. It's just the sales tax that's removed, and it's more like mild incentives over a long period. But in the United States, it seems like you just slap some cash on the table, and it's more like that kind of incentives. But then the US needs to follow up with charging and infrastructure and stuff like that. I think Norway was very early on with this, and it made the EV, when you got your EV, which was of course incentivized, it's easy to live with as well. People don't want to live with an affordable EV. Even people want an affordable electric car, but people won't keep it if it's impossible to own. So I think the United States needs to follow up with like curbside parking everywhere. It needs to like be mandated or something. Why not just have it in the law that you build apartments and then you build parking, because it's probably laws for having parking for apartments. Just add EV charging there. It will be useful in the future anyway. So stuff like that. Norway is not perfect on this either. We have a long way to go for cities and curbside parking, but at least it was thought about very early on.
I do think that's a good point in adding charging as an amenity to like new builds, whether it's big condos or apartment buildings, which I have seen some regulation in some US states, but of course it's more to the state level. And then with curbside charging, I'm very interested in that as well. Convenient level 1, level 2 charging that folks can take advantage of when their car is sitting, which it does most of the time. Well, I think you do have a good point where that you have to go beyond just selling an EV, that people have to enjoy owning. And it does seem like Norway has done that pretty well. But in what ways, I remember now, in what ways do you think we've kind of hit on a lot of ways that they've done it well. I want to talk about what the challenges have been, maybe, because clearly the whole world is going through the challenges of trying to embrace an electrified transportation system. What have those been for Norway? And if you're not sure, maybe looking forward, what do you think the challenges will be?
I think we have challenging stuff coming regarding EVs. We have had an extreme amount of adoption, and we have long ways to go in the cities, even though I talked about we being early on with curbside parking, but honestly, every parking spot needs curbside parking almost, if it's going to be viable for people living in apartments in cities. So that's a major challenge. There are still a lot of people who doesn't have home charging in the cities, even though it's more than most cities in the world, for Oslo and Bergen, for example. But there is also, I think there will be problems getting to 100% EVs, which is the goal of the Norwegian government by 2025, and that's very, very close. And the last 3 years we have been around 80-90% market share, and it has kind of stagnated because people who want fossil cars, those hardcore people that I don't know, maybe they actually need them for purposes and stuff like that, and that makes sense. And I'm not sure if it's right to push them over when we have such a high market share, but anyways, I think it'll be a hurdle to get the last 10% stable market share for electric cars. And also in the transportation sector for heavy duty vehicles, there is actually very good developments on electric trucks from for example, Volvo, Scania, and high power charging for those. But there is still a long way to go in the heavy duty market.
Totally. That 100% goal. I mean, for some countries, it's just so far off, but y'all are actually quite close, hovering around 80 and 90%. But I would think like it's, how you're supposed to take all of your antibiotics and not stop early so that the strong ones don't survive. But not saying the same thing about those last people with, diesel trucks, because you do make a good point in that there are some use cases where electric really isn't there yet. And I think the heavy duty is really hard. It's really just a different undertaking to make electric vehicles efficient in the ways that the medium and heavy duty vehicle industry is. And there's also a different way of functioning. They're usually moving pretty quickly. They're getting jobs done. They're going long distances, whether that's in Norway or, wherever. So there are, I think, industries and use cases that are still hard, but I can imagine going 100% is difficult. But yeah, you've made it this far. That's a pretty big accomplishment towards that kind of goal. And I know that you have done like a video where you go out EV spotting. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit. I know that we might be able to see a Tesla or a Toyota Corolla, not an EV, on the road in Norway. But what else do you see in terms of electric? And are there any, like, we don't get Chinese brands over in the US, right? So maybe you can tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Tesla is the most popular in Norway by far. Other popular single models are the Nissan Leaf, still popular in Norway, even though it has CHAdeMO charging, which is a dying standard. And also the BMW i3 is the most sold single model BMW in Norway, which is kind of interesting. Aside from that, there are a lot of popular brands, like Volkswagen is very popular in Norway. We have always liked the Volkswagen, so the ID4, for example, is a very popular electric car in Norway. And we, of course, have access to the Chinese EV market in Norway. Kind of varied in the Chinese market. Actually, people seem to, I think the Chinese car we have the most of is the Tesla Model 3 built at Giga Shanghai, which is not technically a Chinese-owned company. Tesla is its own company that's operating in China, but people are a little bit reluctant to Chinese EVs, it seems. But there are quite a few great ones that are available, and people buy here in Norway. So you do see them almost every day, some kind of Chinese brand here in Norway.
Interesting lineup that you can see driving on the roads. And I imagine that you see a lot of them with this kind of adoption rate. Like no matter if you go out, you're going to see other EVs, which I think generally now I am spotting more and more EVs on the road. Sometimes it definitely depends on the cities. Like one city I saw so many F-150 Lightnings. I was like, man, okay, this is the town for those. So I think it can definitely change even within a state. And so it's cool to hear what y'all have on the road. They're all familiar to me, except for probably many of the Chinese models, because we just don't get them over here. It really seems like the incentives and the policy and the government push towards making EVs less expensive. You still have competitive pricing there as well. And also making sure that the infrastructure was developed quick enough. You had the first Tesla supercharger in all of Europe, right? And then building on that, of course, not just Tesla, although there are a lot of Teslas in Norway. And those go together really well. Those are what you can control. It seemed also that Norway is a bit lucky. You have roads that encourage a bit more of an efficient driving in EVs, and that's key, versus 85 straight on the highway for as long as you can against a headwind, or even not. It drains quicker. So it seems like a little bit of intention and also a luck. And I mean, luck in a way that y'all have oil and you have these funds that you can put into incentives. Would you agree that it's a bit of balance of planning and also, I don't know, destiny that you're
Ye-
so successful?
Yeah, I think it's the snowball effect. When you are lucky, it's easier to just build on that and be really great at one thing and show the world that it's at least possible. And we do have a harsh environment for, it's low temperatures and stuff like that. And I think that kind of weighs up for the efficiency in terms of just showing the world that, it's possible, and it's absolutely possible everywhere. It just needs some push.
And I think sometimes the climate aspect is something that people are really passionate about. Sometimes it's not. I acknowledge that there's a range of why people might want to go electric, but I think that that has been a focus in Norway as well. And I think you had mentioned before something about like the cold air and the warm air and air quality. And has Norway actually had measurable differences in environmental changes due to this high adoption of EVs on the road?
Yes, mainly because of getting diesel engines out of the cities. Nitrogen oxide is a byproduct of diesel engines, which is not very healthy to breathe in, and arguably less healthy than like the emissions from a gas engine. Anyways, we have seen a major reduction in the major cities after adopting EVs. So that has helped, and it has always been a struggle with air quality in cities in Norway because of the cold weather. It traps the emissions or fumes inside the cities. So that's a nice thing we have seen, that we can measure really. And it's an easy way to show people that might not. Of course, the climate issue is super important, and many people actually think about that in Norway as well and want to reduce their own footprint. But people who really don't care that much about those issues in Norway and across the world can all appreciate better local air quality anyways. And that's very nice numbers to show to those people.
Yeah, think that's pretty convincing for sure. Whether cleaner air is good for everyone, and I think that that has been seen in many places where there's been high adoption of EVs, but especially in places like Norway where it's just significant, the adoption rates and how your whole country has adopted electric into their lives. I wonder if our audience has any ideas of what William has told us about today that can be replicated into a new space. I think in the US we have many different states and we have state governments and everything and different landscapes as well. It's really different across the whole country. And so some things might work somewhere, some things might not. But I'm curious to what our listeners think. Do you have any questions that you want to pose to our listeners as well, William? Something you're curious about or that you're wondering what they're thinking?
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts about what I'm told about Norway, and what do you think can be, like you said, replicated locally where you live?
Yeah, I think that would be cool. Let us know what you think would fit in your spot wherever you are in the world. And if you've ever been to Norway and seen what William has, it seems like a pretty cool place to live. I don't know if I could handle the cold weather, but otherwise, I think it sounds like a pretty cool country. And yeah, thanks for giving me some insight into how Norway became the world leader in EV adoption. Obviously, like we said, I think it's a good bit of planning and a good bit of a good situation to put that planning into. Not everyone has the deep pockets as well as oil, but if we can kind of learn from these examples, I think we're going to be able to take them and put them into really thought out, productive ways of moving electric all around the world. Thank you, William.
Thank you.
Of course. And thanks everyone for tuning in for another episode of the Out of Spec podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Drive safe, stay charged, and we'll see you next time on the next episode. Bye-bye.